Yeah, I'm Sezgin Kaya from Accenture procurement. It took me a while to find a title for my presentation. Lee was asking, what is it going to be? At that morning, I was going to GP for my typical, after 40 examination. And one of the things that he said was, it's because you're getting more and more mature. Well, what do you mean more mature? And then for a non-English speaking, mature means a lot of other things to other people. So in the same day, again, one of my colleagues was saying things like, it's a mature contract. Mature contract. How does that all link? So I thought it's actually an interesting word to use, mature contracts and mature relationships. I'm going to touch a little bit based on how corporate real estate and facilities services over a period of time has become more and more mature, and how do we manage the relationships in mature contracts between the clients and the suppliers. But before I go into that, because I work for procurement, could I ask how many of you are working or have got that procurement in their title? One and a half. How many of you are working in the procurement? Okay. All right, so that's a lot less than I expected, so I'm going to be very careful what I'm talking about procurement then, in that respect. Over the last, as you know, the last few years, what we've seen, if I might explain this a little bit more in a non-consultative way, is over the last few years we've seen that a lot of CRE and FM contractual models have moved in either of these directions. Some of them are going more and more into more integrated type of models. The other ones were also coming back into insourcing. The more that the integrated models are introduced as part of our prime contracts, etc., the more that they were bringing more and more consolidated supply chains. That consolidated supply chain is a transformation in the facilities and corporate real estate to become more mature and long-lasting relationships with their suppliers as well. The further that you go on this scale of different contracts and contractual models, the more that we started seeing more service bundles, looking at more into cultural fit between the suppliers and the clients, the more reliance on the supplier, as well as things like the required contractual investment as well from the supply side. So as the contracts becoming more integrated, more prime, they do have got an expectation from the supply chain and also the people who are managing that supply chain at different and new ways of working, new ways of managing those contracts. According to our recent research about, we are, I mean, as Accenture, we are managing 60% more consolidated CRE and FM spend than 2013 and 14 fiscal year. So whatever has happened in the last two and a half years, it actually starting getting more and more consolidated spend in the clients that we currently see. What does that mean to the clients as well as to the market is the procurement maturity needs to evolve in the sense that you're not necessarily dealing with many suppliers. You're dealing with fewer suppliers, and in a more, if I might explain this as well, in a more mature relationship, but also the clients and suppliers have got more stake in their business relationships as well. So suppliers are becoming more and more proactive when the relationships are getting with fewer suppliers. So having said that, it also imposes a risk if not managed well. So fewer suppliers might also impose a risk in the management of it. But also, on the positive side, greater ability to drive the continuous improvement if managed well. Suppliers might come up with a number of very proactive continuous improvement suggestions if the relationships are well. There is no direct research, as far as I know, that links the contractual duration or contractual maturity to the continuous improvement suggestions that comes from the suppliers, but it's a common expectation from the industry that the more the relationship becomes longer, the more that the clients would expect the suppliers to come up with more proactive continuous improvement ideas. But is that really what's happening? Is that really, because that was one of my biggest questions to the industry, because there's the suppliers and the mature relationships are introduced with the suppliers over 10, 15, in some cases 20 years of relationships with the same supplier in the corporate world. It's not even public sector, it's private. Does that mean that we are managing that relationships well? And I picked up this it's a 7-year contract between the client organization and the supplier. It's a typical example of how it works. And after the client imposes a performance management criteria to the suppliers that they manage. In this example, I'll give you a bit of context on this. In this example, the supplier has been working with this specific client on 7 years. It's 2 generations of outsourcing being done in that time. This is their 3rd contract, getting into the 3rd generation. They worked over 6 years, 1 year transition in the new contract, but they work over 6 years intensively, investing into the assets, investing into reducing the backlog maintenances, and improving the quality of the services over time. At this particular year, the client wanted to measure the performance of that contract, and by relying on a number of criteria like finance, the delivery support, the ease of business, and the quality, all the typical measures that we currently see in the market. But they specifically wanted to understand the perceptive scores between the client scores and the supplier scores. What it was telling us is that looking at the individual scores themselves, although, and there are also greens in there on the supplier's perceptive scores of how they do perform against the client scores of how does the supplier perform. The specific example that they gave to me, and I was trying to make a correlation between how the 2 sides of the perception gap between the supplier and client. After the way that they were qualifying that as a mature relationship, as a mature contract. So when asked, it's a mature contract, we've been working with the supplier over 6 years, we are very happy, but then our scores are not that great, especially in some of the specific areas like the ease of business and the partnership and alignment. When you look at the finance scores, actually the clients scored in finance much higher than the suppliers did. So they are thinking that the price is competitive, the price that they pay at that particular time, or the particular assessment period, is quite competitive against the market that they currently see, but not suppliers. Suppliers are actually have a different perception of the price they've been paid. But the most interesting, although this is a mature contract, the most interesting that struck us was the perceptive scores on the accessibility of the supplier stuff, the red one that you see on there, the first red on the top, the accessibility of supplier stuff, and the specifics about the business alignment, senior leadership accessibility. So if you look at the scores between those two, the variance between that is quite high. So that poses a question around, do we give the right tools, environment, and the processes, even to our most mature contracts and most mature contract relationships, to maintain a perception that the business that the suppliers provide to the clients are actually aligned. So are the business expectations, especially from a senior management point of view, we're not even talking about the quality or the price, we're talking about relationship level. Are we providing the suppliers the right environment for them to operate at a level that they are aligned with their business at a senior level? And the answer is, it's very context driven. In some organizations, we do see that it's happening. Even in the 1 or 2 year into the contract, it does happen. In some of the organizations, it doesn't necessarily happen that even after 7-8 years into the relationship. So that means that not all the contracts with a long-term duration mean that they are mature. in terms of relationship. What are the factors then, it gives us the question, what are the factors that makes that relationship between supplier and the supplier, and supplier and their supply chain, as well as the client, more proactive relationship for them to perform it to success? Can the performance management incentives or the criteria incentivize the suppliers to perform? In an industry where we see the cost breakdown, the cost structure of the labor cost about 58%, the material cost 23%, overheads 13%, 6% on average across the industries, we got more and more pressure on the increasing labor costs. We got more and more pressure on the stringent regulations and the unions and the targets. We got also the war for talent in terms of the best talent to work for the facilities in-house and outsourced companies, as well as a number of desire to invest into technology to cater for more automated solutions in the buildings. There's always a pressure that the cost structure is going to shrink more and more. And on the other side, there's more demanding customers. So for suppliers to balance the cost pressure against the demands of the customers, against the increased competition from the market, against even the things like the saturated service integration in clients' contexts, is bringing that margins lower and lower into a level that is there enough room for further value, for further savings in tangible P&L terms that the suppliers can bring in. And then what capabilities do we really need in order to operate in an industry that's under pressure from both the demand and the suppliers? So from both the supply and also the demand side. And if you do this multiple times, if you go out to the market many times again and again, like if you start outsourcing first, outsourcing second, outsourcing third, and then doing exactly the same thing multiple times, your savings deteriorate. We don't see that there is any value in terms of outsourcing or even sitting down into an RFP conversations with the market after a couple of generations of outsourcing, if you do exactly the same. So from a procurement perspective, and my procurement colleagues will probably nod on that, is after a while, as the savings gets deteriorated, you started focusing on not into corporate real estate and facilities, but you go into other categories to deal with it. You stop looking at facilities, you stop looking at corporate real estate, and you're looking at maybe your marketing spend, maybe your IT spend, maybe your technology, but not facilities at all, because you are again in the same cycle of procurement, procuring the same things again. And that gives a lot of challenge to the procurement folks in your organizations, where if they do not understand where corporate real estate and facilities desire is going, and how would you like to organize your supply chain, then they typically come up with the same answers of either RFP, contract negotiations with the same suppliers in terms of extending contracts, or continuous improvements that they would expect in the more mature relationships. What it doesn't do, and what they cannot do without a fully integrated real estate and procurement, is playing not on the economies of scale, because economies of scale is procurement 101, increasing the scope, increasing scope between facilities, facilities management, office services, projects and fit-out type of spend, gives more scale. But what they cannot do, or they need the real estate and the facilities folks help, is more going on to the next spectrum of this curve, to more into creating an economies of capabilities. And that capabilities is not in the day-to-day running of the procurement operations for their facilities or office supply spend. It's more into understanding the real estate, understand real estate portfolio, understanding discrete savings that they can get from the likes of corporate real estate projects, the capital plan, where is your next portfolio move is going to be, Do you have the right real estate lease administration brokerage services from the supply chain at the right level? Do you have the right level of relationships with your real estate partners to take your portfolio to the next level? That's, I think, where a good, healthy balance between real estate and the procurement organization comes in. The total cost of ownership, as I keep telling to my procurement friends, is not in managing the facilities spend margins, is in managing the portfolio spend, because the cheapest or the most cost-effective way of operating a building is having a no building. If you don't have building at all, you don't need to have anything to save from. And I think we try to change the industry in such a way that, especially on the likes of CPO events, which we were talking about, the procurement industry is absorbing it, and then they are understanding this, that the TCO models, especially in real estate and facilities combined, is a key driver. But what it makes difference, and what it makes, I think, as a barrier for the organizations, or especially on procurement, to understand, is the P&L savings. And typically the quarterly managed, especially in the private sector, quarterly managed P&Ls, having a bottom line effect as of now, whereas real estate have got 5 to 10 years of TCOs that might come in. So there's quite a lot of dialogue that needs to be taken between real estate and procurement organizations in the companies in order to tap into the economies of capability. Procurement cannot do this alone. They need real estate, and real estate cannot do that alone either. They need procurement to get the efficiencies. So I think we're now in a stage that once we are getting into more and more mature contracts with the supply chain, more and more mature even with or without the supply chain, even if we are managing the facilities and real estate in-house, the maturity and the learning points as we had over the last 20 years, I'm sure that everybody in this room has once in their life, at the very least, outsourced a facility service or real estate service in their lives. As we've started doing this more and more, I think the value that we get from the suppliers as well as from the market is not stopping at the margins, it's actually continuing into more capabilities that we've developed between real estate and procurement. In some respects, it's actually better for the suppliers as well, because when suppliers are coming into negotiation tables with the procurement, they have a different message than they hear from real estate or facilities. Aligning those two together with the demand from the business, understanding customer relationship, as well as the market requirements, the suppliers have got better confidence that to put a more robust proposal on the table, but also convince the parties around what the value that they can bring into the game. The worst thing in that is for a supplier to do two different conversations, which I've seen that in the past as well, between procurement and real estate. Real estate sees the contract right at the end. They don't even sometimes read the contract. So then they find the contract at the end of the negotiations. Procurement does the negotiations, and then it leaves the real estate to operate that contract. But when we look at the workload that goes into building up a relationship between a supplier and the client, typically about 50% of the workload goes into contract making, setting up a contract, a deal. 10% of that is physically putting a contract in place for legal, and then 40% is all about making sure that it works. So the honor that the 40% goes into real estate organizations and facilities organizations to operate. If we don't have the continuity between the parties to carry on, not only operating but also understanding how the deal has been struck in the first place, it gives the gaps in terms of the understanding and the perceptions in the level of the services being provided. The example I've shown you previously was a good example of how that gap was caused. It's not only the maturity, but also it is the alignment between real estate and procurement. What procurement bought was not what real estate expected. And for suppliers, it's even worse. It's a nightmare, because then they've done two different negotiations with two different buyers, and it's even worse. it hardly ever, from a supplier perspective, it hardly ever starts at this place, because if you look at the right price and profit balance for a supplier, the deal never starts from scratch. The deal starts from a relationship. The deal starts from a reference point that the suppliers bring in. I might be completely wrong on this, but I could hardly ever think of, especially after second generation or third generation outsourcing, I could hardly think of any supplier that build up a relationship with with a client almost from scratch. They need to invest some time in order to build up that relationship and getting rid of that transactional treatment. Especially with the strategic suppliers, especially with the suppliers that are operating at tier 1 level from procurement perspective. These are the suppliers that they need to invest in time in order to make that deal work over a longer period of time. So that's why starting a deal with investing a lot of time and effort right up front, with so much time on the RFPs, with so much time between PQQs and RFIs and all that paperwork that goes into, that makes it more artificial rather than productive in terms of getting some output from the suppliers in terms of their contribution to the solution. And do we really do a good work in there between procurement and real estate organizations? If procurement is transactional, we try to put the paperwork together. We put the RFPs together. If the procurement is more proactive, they come closer to real estate and then become more aligned to the real estate to understand what that requirements are and then develop a solution together with the suppliers. But it's hardly ever that we see that a deal starts from scratch. And when I say from scratch, it means that almost like a white paper. You've got no understanding of the business. You've got no understanding as a supplier. If you don't have any understanding of the business market, or have got understanding of that specific context, it's very difficult to build up that in the process, and then win the competition over. So that's getting into it, but also maintaining that goes over that as well. So maintaining that relationship over time is also, the more transactional it becomes, the more likely that the client is going to be unhappy with the relationship. So there's a nice balance in terms of the importance of an ongoing relationship against the importance of the deal terms that we develop. I will stop at this point, and if there are any questions, I can take it here. And
you mentioned when you were talking, you sort of implied that procurement led the activity and that facilities just took it over when you'd done the deal. Surely facilities or property should be much more involved in the whole process and actually should lead it, with procurement delivering the transactional expertise on it rather than the content expertise?
Yeah, that's definitely. So the ideal scenario is both of them should lead together. So there should be a joint governance between procurement and real estate to drive it together. In some organizations, it's turning into shared services organization between procurement and real estate. I think there's a healthy dialogue there, where if we see the real estate and procurement leading the activity jointly rather than in alignment or in tandem. It needs to be in parallel, not one after the other. I think there's a real danger in the industry where we don't see the alignment between procurement and real estate, and that leaves significant contractual gaps. Even though the relationship is a mature relationship and the parties have got a lot of investment from their sides, when you look at the contracts themselves, I'm not a legal person, but reading a lot of contracts in my professional life, there are so many gaps in the contracts if they're not actually linked between the real estate and the procurement. If procurement, exactly like you said, if your procurement doesn't know what the content, how would they know what to buy?